Last summer, I finally got the opportunity to make a retreat at a place I've been wanting to visit for years. I drove up to the new Camaldoli Hermitage in Big Sur, California for an 8-day silent retreat. I've done week-long retreats before on the East Coast, but never here in California. I've been wanting to share the story of my experience of extended retreat here on the podcast. I'm glad I finally get that opportunity today. Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Did you know that you could join a community of listeners to this podcast who are hungry to grow deeper in the unhurried way of Jesus? There's nothing quite like having a group of like-minded friends with whom to share the journey. We call this group Unhurried Leaders, and in 2024, we are going through my new book, A Non-Anxious Life, in a monthly live Zoom to talk about how to live in the unhurried way of God's peace. We have 4 years of archived monthly recordings that can resource your spiritual journey. I'd love to have you join this growing online community of men and women. It's one of my most encouraging hours every month. To learn more and to join this group, please visit unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's all one word. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm glad you found us. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love if you'd share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. At the end of August 2023, I made the drive from Orange County, where I live, up to Big Sur, California. A number of Christian leader friends who lived in Northern California spoke highly about their experiences at the new Camaldoli Hermitage. Now I was finally going to make my own visit. I learned that New Camaldoli is part of the larger Camaldoli's order founded 1,000 years ago by Saint Romuald in Camaldoli, Italy, which is about 40 miles east of Florence. They sought to combine the gift of communal monasticism and solitary monasticism. New Camaldoli Hermitage has been in Big Sur since the late 1950s. Their life is one of prayer, seeking union with God in the way of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Their life as monks involved them in solitude and community, silence and interaction, prayer and work, study and recreation. I could not wait to share a week in this kind of place. The location itself lends well to the practice of silent retreat. First of all, it is a cellular and Wi-Fi desert. No coverage, no internet access. The only way to connect with the outside world is to use one of the 2 phone lines on site. And since the whole community uses those 2 lines, they are not very often available even if you wanted to talk with someone back at home. Now, some would consider this a liability, but if you're seeking a place of solitude, silence, and non-distraction, this is a rare and beautiful benefit. The Hermitage has a bluff-side view of the ocean that is absolutely inspiring. I have always loved the ocean, and having a vista view of it for a week was such a gift. Not only all this, but over the years, Big Sur has had huge landslides that have closed Highway 1 for months at a stretch. And after a landslide in early 2023, the monastery was inaccessible from either the north or the south for months. In fact, I wasn't certain it would reopen in time for my August retreat. But thankfully, just before my retreat, the road was reopened from the north to local traffic only, and I was able to make my visit. I had to stop at a Caltrans checkpoint and show my reservation confirmation to be let through. I then drove a couple of miles along only partially repaired highway to reach the Hermitage. Once you get there, there's a 2-mile long, steep and winding driveway that takes you up to about 1,300 feet where the Hermitage sits. It wasn't going to be easy leaving the monastery, and so I was committed to 8 days of retreat that I had planned. Another feature of this hermitage is that most of the housing is in individual and solitary tiny houses spread out from one another on their 900 acres of property. Many monastic retreats I've visited have apartment-like housing for guests, and that is an option at the Hermitage as well. But when I was in my own hermitage, there wasn't another person or another house in view. I was the only one there. At least that's what it felt like. And all I could see was the ocean that lay before me. Meals in most monastery retreats are communal, even if they are in silence. But we ate in our hermitages, having gone up to a small kitchen to get our daily food and bring it back to our houses. Solitude is taken very seriously at New Camaldoli. Another gift of this monastery, like most, was their observance of hours of prayer to which guests are welcome. These hours of prayer are rather simple and draw on a single prayer volume used year-round. I found praying the Psalms and hearing Scripture read in this way deeply enriching. The simplicity of these hours of prayer and the flexibility of meals was a great gift. Being on a retreat like this for a full week gave me opportunities to actually lose track of time. I don't have to tell you that that doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often for me anyway. But the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing suggests that time is made for people, not people for time. We are not meant to serve time, but time is there to be of service to us. We are not slaves of our time, of our calendars, of our schedules, of our engagements. Time is there to serve us. And this is something you learn deeply on an extended retreat like the one I made. One gift I was given on my first day as I was checking in was finding that there was a copy of my first book, An Unhurried Life, on the bookstore shelves. I'd heard from a friend a long time back that they'd seen it there, but I was pleasantly surprised that it was still there in stock. Now, let me share a little bit about my actual experience of retreat. Mainly, it was a time and a place for prayer. Being somewhere that has been a place of prayer for decades is a great privilege. There's something about such a place that helps me notice God's presence more easily. It's what the Celtic Christians called a thin place. One of the advantages of such a retreat time and place is the chance to be attentive to the presence of God and to simply acknowledge what is happening in our own hearts and souls. There are so many ways to distract ourselves these days, and so it's a great gift to be in a place and in a community where most of these outward distractions simply aren't possible. I happen to be a very high structure person. I like arranging my time in great detail. So it probably won't surprise you that I often try to do this with my retreats as well. I mean, there's nothing wrong with structure unless structure gets in the way of what God might want to do. It took me a couple of days out of the 8 trying to actively micromanage my retreat when I finally ran out of gas for that sort of thing and settled into a more receptive posture in the presence of God. Monks speak of making a retreat, but I also think there is a posture of receiving a retreat that helps. That's because as a leader, I'm so used to making things happen or imagining that the main things that are happening are of my making alone. But an extended retreat is a chance to tune into what God may be doing, how God may be speaking, where God may be guiding. This sort of practice has grown my ability to discern God in the middle of my busy work life back at home. In a chapter of my book, A Non-Anxious Life, titled Rhythms of Peace, I talk about 6 postures that help us engage well in spiritual retreat. And these postures served me well in those 8 days. Those postures are solitude, silence, stillness, sameness, stability, and simplicity. These are a variety of holy no's that I stay with so as to be able to offer God a more wholehearted yes on retreat. They open for me the way to notice God's company, God's voice, God's movement, God's creativity, God's presence, God's richness. This awareness deepens over the course of a retreat for me. And I bring that back with me to my life, my relationships, and my work. It's hard for me to overestimate the value that this retreat process has had in my life over the years. Let me share a little bit about how I plan for a retreat. Generally, I calendar my retreats about a year ahead. I don't hope that I'll have time for a retreat. If I wait until weeks before a potential retreat, my calendar will generally have already filled. I've learned that it's better to calendar my priorities than to prioritize my calendar. Can you feel the difference? When I prioritize my calendar, I may just be reorganizing all the stuff that has happened to land there. When I calendar my priorities, I make time and space for the important and valuable opportunities that wouldn't usually end up on my calendar otherwise. Too many of my priorities don't end up in my schedule if I'm not intentional about them well in advance. I planned nearly a year in advance for this 8-day retreat in Big Sur. Then as I got closer, I put other important engagements elsewhere in my calendar. I wasn't going to just happen to find a week to get away, and the Hermitage is in enough demand that I wouldn't have found open space there if I waited to schedule my retreat. Now, as I prepare for a retreat, I find something Jesus said particularly helpful. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Often I'll ask myself a couple of questions in my planning. First, what will I say a gracious and firm no to during my retreat? And what will I say a hearty and grateful yes to during my retreat? Usually, I say a complete no to internet connectivity during these extended retreats. I let people know I won't be available in that window. I have someone else keep an eye on things while I'm away. I sometimes say no to eating everything I might usually eat. That's to say, I practice some form of fasting. I sometimes say no to certain kinds of recreational reading or to watching programs on television or streaming services. Now, none of these were available to me anyway at the Hermitage. My no is a way of making space for the grace God wants to give me and the yes I want to say to His generosity. Some of the yeses I've often said on retreat have been to be active daily, taking a walk, or engaging in some form of exercise. I've often said yes to a spiritual reading book that I want to sink into and learn from. I've often said yes to moments of simple and quiet listening. The main yes I offer is my attention to God who is with me. I remember that on day 5 of this retreat, I had settled in and I had then set aside the morning between breakfast and lunch to sit on my Hermitage porch alone and quiet with God. For hours, I looked out at the ocean that filled my horizon. I listened for the sounds of creation and the content of my own heart and mind, and I listened for the voice of God. I began to notice the other creatures who were there with me in that moment. I noticed a small rabbit that hopped into view My hermitage was nestled in a rather wild space. The bunny looked like it was looking for breakfast. As I was still, he stayed put, nibbling at the weeds that grew below me. He seemed to chew forever. Sometimes he sat perfectly still as though he were trying not to be seen. Maybe it was because he was a monastery bunny, but he was clearly quite good at the practice of retreat. He was comfortable with solitude. He had no problem being silent. He was quite still. The sameness of his situation didn't seem to bother him. He was observing a posture of stability. He stayed put. And simplicity seemed natural for him. I watched that bunny enjoy his breakfast for about an hour. When do I ever have time or opportunity to do something like that? You might even ask why I would bother doing something like that. But this is the sort of thing that artists and creatives do. It's how they come to see the world with greater clarity so that they can express what they've seen in good words, good music, good images, or good artifacts. Maybe you don't think of yourself as a creative sort of person. Maybe you think that's relatively impractical to the work that you do. But I wonder, what difference might it make if you had more creativity in your life, in your friendships, even in the work that you do? What if you had fresh vision for the work God has actually given you to do? Wouldn't that make a difference? I've often said that my best ideas have nearly always come in retreat or out of retreat. The same is true of finding creative solutions to problems I was facing. On retreat, I've been able to gain a clearer vision of where I believe God is leading me and of the work I believe God is giving me to do. Now, if you are thinking about trying on this practice, what kind of place is a good one? Where do you retreat? Now, just like the Hermitage, I've often taken advantage of Catholic retreat centers and monasteries. Sometimes it seems like Christians in my own neighborhood of the church design getaway places that are more for gathering large groups to hear talks from people who are experts or who are entertaining. That can be a very joyful thing. But conference centers aren't always the same as retreat centers. It can sometimes be hard to get alone or to find quiet. So I recommend that you find a place where you can find some solitude and silence. Search the internet for monasteries or retreat centers that happen to be in your area. Or search for places like this in a part of the country you've always wanted to visit. Retreating at a location designed for that purpose makes keeping to the intent of your retreat easier to do. Once you've found a place, what do you do on retreat? In an extended retreat, I seek to find a balance between structure and freedom, activity and receptivity, engagement and disengagement, even between work and rest. Now, the work I'm talking about is not measuring my retreat in terms of productivity, though a rhythm of retreat in my life over the last 30 years has been among the most fruitful practices in my life. A way perhaps to discern these rhythms is, in fact, to pay attention to the desires that arise in me. Sometimes as a leader, there is very little space between an impulse that arises and an action that I take. On retreat, I have time and space to notice the desires that arise, discern whether they move me in good directions or not, and then decide how I want to act on them or resist them. Perhaps retreat is a place where a variety of Augustine's counsel comes into play. He said, "Love God and do whatever you please, for the soul trained in love to God will do nothing to offend the one who is beloved." I have space on extended retreat to discern shallow and empty impulses from deep, God-given desires. I can resist the former and lean into the latter. What does the me who has been created in the image of Christ want to do with these days? Do I know? Can I be patient to discern the answer to such a question? Again, on extended retreat, we have the time and the space to listen for that insight. As I've mentioned already, on a multiple-day retreat, I want to be sure I haven't programmed every minute. This is sometimes the mistake I've made. In this sort of retreat, we can make time for unstructured receptivity to God. This is a way of talking about practicing God's presence in simplicity. We listen for God. We watch for God. We seek to notice the creativity and care of God that surrounds us. We let God shepherd us on our retreat. Now, what have been some of the benefits I gained from retreat? It has been good for me to practice retreat as a regular rhythm rather than as an occasional escape when I'm desperate. The Gospel of Luke reminds us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. It's the word often that always grabs me there. There was a regularity to this rhythm in Jesus' way of life. And that regularity was focused on prayer, which is to say, Jesus regularly made time and space to step away from what usually filled his days to be in undivided communion with his Father in heaven. He rested in the presence of his Father. He listened for the voice of his Father. He watched for the work of his Father. And he spoke to the Father about what was on his mind and heart, what concerned him, and what he hoped for. He was often alone in his Father's presence, and I believe this was the way in which he knew what the Father was giving him to do and to say. Retreat has been such a training ground for me. If you haven't been in the habit of making personal retreats, I don't recommend starting with an 8-day version. You aren't seeking to do something spiritually heroic. That can be much more about ego than it is about seeking God. Set aside an hour or two, maybe half a day. Decide on a length of time that feels like a stretch without feeling overwhelming. Decide what you're going to say yes to and what you'll say no to. Then offer this as a gift to God. What makes the time good is not your spiritual performance or a spiritual experience you might or might not have. That God is with you and that you are offering your attention to notice God with you is what makes such a retreat practice so good. If you aren't already trying on the practice of spiritual retreat, I hope you'll take a next step. If you do, I hope you discover that the grace of this practice grows over time. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.